Hello watercolor lovers, welcome to my YouTube channel Watercolor Impressions. I've been doing a few summer paintings on our channel, so I thought it would be nice to continue till end of summer. This reference was taken when I went for kayak for the first time at Ontario Place in Toronto. It provided a nice edge composition and a crisp backlighting. As always, I'll provide the drawing template and reference. You can check the description below to download it so that you guys can follow with me. Before we get onto it, hit that subscribe button so that you guys can get weekly video updates from our channel. And let's get started, guys. I always start from painting from top to bottom because I also paint in a 30-degree angle. So when I paint in watercolors, the colors run through from top to the bottom and it blends by itself. And in any watercolors, you start with a light wash. So I'm starting with the sky. I'm using cobalt blue for it, and I'm also taking it all the way down till the boat, which is in the foreground. And you can also see I also left some white bits for the clouds, the darker clouds in the background. Being said that, my vision in this painting is to capture the Kayak Rider in the foreground. So whenever you paint, make sure you have a vision, then you focus on it. Because a lot of people, or when I started painting, I focused more on the background than my rest of my painting. Once we finish the sky, let's focus on other elements in our painting. So first I will start with the dome. So I'll start from the foreground, background to the foreground. So for the dome, I'm using a little bit of white paint, and I'm also using neutral tint to get a shading on top of the dome, because usually domes have some kind of gradient from top to bottom, so I'm adding that. And there is also eyelet happening on the dome, but we will add it later. So I'm also focusing on the boats now. So in any painting, connecting shape is really imperative. So you have to make sure the shapes are connected and it's not standing by itself, and it looks really ugly in the painting. So now I'm jumping onto the foreground building, which is on the right hand side. For that, there's a lot of things happening in the foreground, but I'm also making sure to bring it as a single shape. So for the water, I'm using cobalt blue. So I'm making sure to leave some highlights and painting over our Kayak Rider. I'll keep building the pigment in the foreground for the water so that it gives a beautiful lead-in for it. And I also created an impression of waves with a thick pigment. Once it spreads out, it will give an impression of waves in our painting. So now we're almost finished the first wash, so let's jump onto the background. When I started with watercolors, I spent more time on the background. I didn't realize that it doesn't matter, because background is just a background. It's going to act as a background for it. If you look at any master paintings or any of the older paintings, you will see it's like a mirror shape for the background, and they spend more details in the foreground and the focal point, because when you see a painting from the far, it doesn't matter. So now I'm jumping on to the details in the foreground building. I'm also making sure to create an impression of it as well, because our focal point is the Kayak Rider. So I'm just looking for a darker shape and squinting my eyes and putting the details whenever I see a darker pigment in the foreground building. So I kept doing that, and I also went ahead and finished that same thing with the Pion's Gray on the left side of our bridge and the platform. Now let's focus on some of the foreground elements in the foreground. So for the foreground elements, I usually use a dry brush, as you can see, because it's going to have a stronger pigment, and it also gives a beautiful lead-in for us. And you can also see there's flags flying in the foreground, and which is also recedes to the background. So this kind of things, which helps us to create perspective. So I want to make sure that I get it right. So for the dry brushing technique, I use a lot of Pion's Gray and a little bit of burnt umber in it. Now I jumped on to my Kayak Rider. For the Kayak Rider, I'm starting with my light wash because I want to see, the values of it before I go darker. Even though the Kayak Rider is a lot of gray in it, but I want to put a lot of blue in it so that it kind of creates a unity in our painting, so it also blends with the kayak as well. So I'm going a little bit darker for his life jacket, and it's going to dry. Even though it looks darker now, watercolor tends to get lighter as it dries out. So I'm keeping in mind I'm going a little bit darker on it. And she's also have hair, so I'm going to put like a burnt amber for her hair, and I'm keep building the pigment, and I'm squinting my eyes several times to see the darker values for the kayak and leaving the eyelets based on my reference. Now we are done with the first wash. It's a matter of bringing back the values based on the reference. As you can see, even though the paddle, what she's holding, is blue in color, but I want to have a little bit of variation in it. So I used cobalt turquoise for the paddle, and for the handle, I used a Pion's gray for it. Now let's jump onto the flags, the Canadian flag. So there is, so usually the Canadian flag is red in color, but there's a little bit of transparency in the flag, so I want to make it light. So I'm using cadmium red and a little bit of white in it so that it doesn't look like that. For the middle part, what I did is I used a little bit of white paint and a little bit of yellow ochre in it to create that warmth in the flag so that it kind of blends properly with our flag. So now I'm adding a figure who is like standing on top of the boat. Now let's put some love on the kayak boat. So I'm using a lot of ultramarine blue, French ultramarine blue with a thicker pigment to create the shadow and the details for the Kayak Rider. And I'm also trying to create a shape. It looks like it's floating now, but as soon as we add the shadow, it will make sense in a second. So, but the shadows we'll add at the end. So now I'm focusing on the background water. I want to make sure my background water is really light, even though in reality it looks dark, because I want my background water not to read as much as I want, because I want to create a sense of depth from the foreground to the background. So for the water, I'm using Pion's gray and a little bit of cobalt blue. You can also mix French ultramarine for it. So if you see on the left side, there is a lot of shadow happening, the darker shadow happening from the platform. For that, I'm using a lot of sepia and French ultramarine blue and a little bit of Pion's gray in it. But as it comes to the foreground, I'm using cobalt blue and a little bit of French ultramarine blue in it. But as it comes close to the foreground, I'm going to increase the pigment consistency for the water, because that will create a beautiful depth and it will take us and lead us into the painting to the Kayak Rider. So I'm also making sure that leaving some highlights here and there. I'm not covering everything. Whenever you paint, make sure that when you're painting water or any kind of highlights, make sure to leave some bits, so that it gives illusion of a light in your painting. So now once I'm happy with the pigment consistency of foreground, so I'm taking sepia and a little bit of Pion's gray in my brush, and the shadows from the platform is super dark, so I want to get that value right in the waves. So I'm kind of like keep building it unless I'm happy with the values, and I'm also making sure that I'm not covering the light in our water, because the light which pops our painting. Let's anchor the Kayak Rider on the water. So for the shadow, for the anchoring, I'm using French ultramarine blue and a little bit of neutral tint in it. So I'm using Pion's gray for it. And I also a little bit of cobalt blue in it. Once it spreads out, it will give a beautiful impression of waves. And even though in reference there is a lot of complicated things happening, but I want to make sure that it gives the impression of waves. And as soon as we added that, you could see the painting came alive and everything came into place. So I'm also going a little bit darker where the boat anchors, and I'm making sure that I'm getting the silhouette right. So I'm spending more time on it, and there's also lighter value happening at the kayak as well. I'm adding that as well. So I'm keep building up the pigment until I'm happy with it. Let's add some added details for the paddle. For the paddle holder, I'm using Pion's gray. I want a darker pigment, and for the paddle, I'm using French ultramarine blue to create some kind of forms for the paddle itself. So once I'm happy with the paddle, I'm going to take white paint to bring back some of the highlights in our painting. So whenever you highlights, make sure that you don't overboard with it, because sometimes I overboard personally with it as well. So make sure you don't do it. So you can see as soon as I added that highlight on the paddle holder, the lighting popped in our painting. And I also noticed that there was an highlight which is peeking through the boat, so I'm also adding that. So I want to match my highlights in the foreground as much as possible, because that's our focal point. So I'll be spending more time adding the highlights in the foreground and the rest of the painting. Once I'm happy with the highlights, I'm squinting my eyes and I saw that the foreground building to the midground building, the values are not aligning properly, so I'm just glazing over with French ultramarine blue and a little bit of neutral tint in it. And I'm also bringing some of the highlights in the midground and also adding some darker values so that it comes to the foreground and there's a sense of depth in the buildings as well. And I'm adding a little bit of birds here and there to get a floating feeling in the sky, and a couple of marks here and there, and that's it, folks. And we are at the end of our painting journey. Thanks again for watching this Kayak Rider painting in watercolors. You can also check the playlist for all summer paintings in my channel as well. Let me know what you learned from this video and what's your favorite color in this painting. If you have any other requests or subjects you want me to cover in watercolors, let me know in the comments or write me at watercolorimpressions@gmail.com. Thanks again for watching this tutorial. Please hit that subscribe button so you guys can get weekly video updates from our channel. And please do share with your friends and family. And good luck with your painting, folks.